Bold ones, welcome to another episode of Act Bold. Today on the podcast, I have Veronica Dress. She is a sex educator and coach and an intimacy coordinator. I am super excited to ask her all the nitty-gritty questions. I personally have a lot of questions around this. So, Veronica, welcome to Act Bold, and how are you today?
Hi. Oh, I am so excited to be here. Yeah, I'm
Yay!
I'm just absolutely jazzed.
Wonderful. Well, that's a good start. That's a good start.
Yeah,
Okay, I am not familiar with what a sex educator does beyond what I took in high school.
sure.
So, what does that even look like for adults? Or is that for adults?
Yeah. Yeah. So I work largely with adults. I'll still do some like high school workshops here and there. Um, but I work with a lot of adults on the layers of sexuality education that most of us, especially in the United States, didn't get in school. Like the sex education throughout the United States is um, kind of a crapshoot in terms of what you get, depending on what district you're in, what state you're in, who's your teacher. There's not a ton of training that happens. And so folks get what I would consider the like bare bones basics, maybe, of anatomy and how pregnancy happens in school, but don't really learn about communication or how desire
Mm,
works or arousal works or what are the things that impact our ability to feel attraction and what does it look like if I'm not a straight cisgender person and I want to figure out like how my identity looks and feels most authentic for me, like what support do I need, how do I communicate boundaries and what does consent look like and mean,
mm. And that is
and all of those
so
things.
important. I mean, I just remember, I'm a woman of a certain generation, right? I was born in
Mhm.
1966.
Cool.
And I think girls today can advocate for themselves better. And yet I also feel like they're so sexualized and they're so used to making that a part of their identity that maybe they're not advocating for themselves. And I really wish that I had had more of that kind of training, like when to say no, because girls are kind of
Uh,
taught to be nice. You don't want to hurt
mhm.
somebody's feelings.
No, never.
I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous. And I mean, if I only knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have slept with a few of the guys I slept with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we grow up and assume that everyone else has figured it out somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
Or like in lieu of sex ed that's really comprehensive and like rooted in like how we do relationships, folks are just kind of taking in a lot of messages and shoulds from pop culture,
Mm,
from movies and TV and
yeah.
what they see in the world around them rather than having a space to be really curious about how does this look? How do I want this to look for me? Like, what do I
Yeah.
actually want my relationships to look like? And how how do I experience pleasure best? Maybe it's not
Yeah.
from the things sex scenes in movies tell me I'm supposed
Which
to
are male-centric
experience.
anyway. Yeah.
Right. And so
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
like acknowledging all of these socialization things that you've already started to mention, right? That like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe I thought I was supposed to experience pleasure this way, but actually I don't. I experience it this way.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us I find are like kind of like spending our lives cheating off of our friends' papers, being like, cool, that's how you do relationships. That's me too.
Yeah.
That's how I do it.
Yeah.
Um, and so giving folks the space to get curious about like their values and how they want to move through this part of their life and like actually like have confidence and joy.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
That's
it's
beautiful. I
lovely.
love that. And it was a great segue into intimacy coordination because that's what actors deal with, right?
Yes.
So I've actually never worked with an intimacy coordinator, though I've done many, many love scenes, sex scenes, kiss
Yeah.
scenes.
Mhm.
And I've actually here's something, and I wonder if having had an intimacy coordinator on set might have saved me from this. I've
Mm.
actually like backed out of things because I knew I was going to have to get intimate with someone that I was not even like repulsed by, as
Mm.
opposed to attracted to.
Yeah.
And would that help? I'm curious.
Um,
Would that even help?
yeah. Well, I think it could. So, an intimacy director, we have these different like kind of pillars of how we approach the work, and
Mm,
parts of it, right? Consent is one, communication, choreography, closure, which I think is one that is one of my favorites to talk about with folks, and I think perhaps could be helpful here, is like acting is such a niche job in that you go to work and you are expected to engage in like really intimate, vulnerable connection with people who are your colleagues, whether or not it's a scene of physical intimacy, right? Because I think
Yeah.
like intimacy is a bazillion forms.
Sure. Yeah.
And when we don't have the workplace protections for people to be like, what are the conversations that need to happen in order for me to have like solid expectations about what's going to happen in the scene, that my scene partner, their hand isn't going to move to a place we didn't agree to. What does it look like to like accept that there is a difference between me, the actor, and this person, the actor, and our characters, right? I might personally not be attracted to this human that is my scene partner. And that's okay. That's honestly like part of the job. But do I feel safe enough with them and that our communication has been clear enough and our choreography has been like understood and agreed upon enough that we have like a really sturdy foundation from which to enter into this experience so
Yeah.
that even if I, as Veronica, am not attracted to this human, like that part doesn't really matter. And in fact, if you were attracted to that human, it might get more complicated, right? The lines between character and self might get muddy, in a really funky way because our nervous systems are not as nuanced as our sweet brains are. Our nervous
Right.
systems are like, oh, we're performing attraction, so we must be attracted to this
Yeah.
person. And so
Yeah.
that's why
Yeah.
having like these check-ins and check-outs is really supportive so that we can be like, oh, right, my body doesn't know I'm acting. My body is like my biggest fan as an actor. And it's like, I believed every second of that panic attack you had on the screen.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like,
Right.
I believe every second. Like, how do
Yeah.
we like release this and like leave it at work or leave it in the scene? And
Yeah.
so having a buddy to help navigate all of that with you and feel like you weren't alone in navigating those moments and those scenes would have been incredibly supportive, I
So,
think.
Veronica, walk me through that because
Yeah.
I don't know. I get it. I
Yeah.
get it, but
Hmm.
I'm having maybe, and it's maybe just I'm trying to think what is my problem? Like,
Hmm.
I'm, what is your problem? It's, because, yeah, I do rely on a lot of method skills. So
Okay.
that brings in a lot of who I
Totally.
am and,
Totally.
where I am. And so, like, having an intimacy coordinator there, what does that look like? Is that like someone literally like where is it like when you're practicing for a dance routine, you're sort of like slowly working your way through it and
Yeah.
or because sex is great
Mhm,
sex, right?
mhm,
Is spontaneous. This is in
mhm.
real life and and this is what you want it to look like that
Mhm.
combustion
Sure.
on film, right?
Mhm.
So how does that happen? How do you make that
Uh,
happen when everything is so well choreographed?
yeah, absolutely. And I think even in life outside of stage and screen, great sex has spontaneity of like what is happening in the moment, like where does
Yeah.
the hand go next?
Yeah.
But I would also, this is like sex educator and coach hat, I would also say that great sex has foundations of like intentionality, right? That like I know enough about like how safe I am in this moment with this person that I can let myself go there, right?
Yeah.
Our nervous
Meaning,
system.
what does that sound like? Would that be like me saying,
Mm,
"I'm okay with you touching everything from the waist up," or "I'm
yeah,
okay with you touching
yeah,
everything on my backside," whatever, or
yeah.
I'm
So
okay with you putting your hand between my legs," whatever it may happen to be, right? But
yeah,
you have to
so
say those things.
absolutely. So in an intimacy direction space, I mostly work in stage. So I'll use those examples, but a lot of this is kind of like applicable in film as well. Um that I get the script, I read through it, I scan for all the moments that I think could potentially be um include intimacy. And for me as an intimacy director looking through that, I'm not just looking at physical touch. I'm also thinking about, we talk about hyperexposure, which I love as a concept because it's so subjective, right? Like perhaps there isn't physical touch, but there's a scene that involves potentially a lot of like um microaggressions, or like this character is getting misgendered continually through the play. Maybe I, as the intimacy director, should check in with that actor who who is also maybe non-binary and say like, okay,
Mm,
what do you need? Like what systems and structures can we put in place that you as a human feel affirmed enough that you can continue to put your character through this story over and over and over again? Because that is a thing, right? And so like ways that hyperexposure or like particularly activating moments get some attention as well, right? That we're making sure, my goal is to make sure that the folks who are creating art get to create it as long as they want to. And
yeah,
to me, that means being able to do that sustainably and not burning yourself out at the altar of the production, and
yeah,
finding that balance, because you are a human first and foremost. And are, I think a lot of us come from a space where it's like, leave it all at the door. And
mm,
a big piece of intimacy direction is context. Like, what is the context of the scene, these characters, this moment, the
mm.
place in which we are staging this production, but also our personal context. Like, what, maybe this is my first on stage kiss. I work with high school students putting on productions a lot.
Oh,
And
wow. Okay.
students
Yeah,
are like,
sure.
oh my God, I don't want to.
My mom and dad are gonna see me kissing this
Yes.
guy. Yeah, I
Or
totally
like,
get it.
I've
Yeah.
never been kissed before and I don't want my
Oh,
first kiss to
wow.
happen on
Oh my
stage or
god.
screen,
Yeah,
right?
no, yeah.
And so the lives that we live, while I understand like leaving the drama at the door or leaving whatever other things at the door, I also think that our personal lived experiences are the well from which we draw a lot of
Mm,
our art. And
mhm,
so being intentional about those things actually gives us shared language and a space to intentionally create something that's much more compelling.
mm,
And so I read through the script, all of those things, and then once folks are cast in a dream world, and I think this is becoming the standard, when folks are at scene audition notices, it will say what characters engage in what amount of physical intimacy. So folks have some
mhm.
expectations going even into the audition,
Sure.
rather than like getting the part and being so excited and then being like, oh my God, there's a nude scene that I didn't know
Yeah.
about. Right.
Mhm,
Um, and then I have a like phone call check-in with all of the actors who are engaged in any intimacy to chat before we're even in the space, to be like, hey, how are we feeling? What questions do you have for me? What concerns as we look at this scene that we're going to do together? Like, what are some boundaries or some like things that you're really like, oh my God, I really hope it doesn't include this or it doesn't? Because there are a million ways to tell a physical story that
mm.
have the same energy and impact. And when our nervous systems are regulated, we actually make much bolder choices. When we feel like we know what is going on and we have all the information needed, we actually create richer
Wow.
art.
Okay,
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And so, and we see that like throughout Hollywood, so many folks are
Well,
in
I
their
mean, now that
interviews
you
saying that.
say that, yeah, I'm thinking to workshops immediately, and the first thing that you always hear in any acting workshop is, "This is a safe space. You're
Yeah.
safe to explore, you're safe to experiment, you're safe to make mistakes." And
Mhm.
I think that, yeah, I could see where just saying like, this is what is going to happen, or these are the
Mhm.
boundaries, but anywhere within
Yes.
these boundaries, you
Okay.
are free to go. Because I
Yes.
think it's often sometimes the question in our heads of like, am I doing this right? Am I doing it wrong? That can
Yeah.
keep people from just
Right.
letting go and doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And our and it's not just what am I doing it right? It's also like what is my scene partner about to do too? And when we think about like the larger context of how we each as humans move through relationships or sex or intimacy or the information we've ever received, it most of us, or at least in the United States, I can't speak to Europe because I feel like y'all are much farther ahead in how we have these
Yeah.
conversations than at least in schools here in the United States, that folks don't have the skills to self-advocate or aren't encouraged to self-advocate or
No, they're
have
encouraged not to
this
think about it. Don't think about it, don't
right,
do it. You know,
right. Exactly. Don't
basically.
think
Yeah.
about it. Don't do it. And depending on like the social stereotypes or messages we're given, it's like they're like for people who are socialized in the world as women, we are told to be easy to get along with and accommodating and to not make waves. And this idea of, well, if you don't want to do it, there are a million other people who auditioned that'll do it, right? This urgency and this pressure. Whereas, and if we're not confident in our like own lives around these things, it is very silly to imagine that all of a sudden this wisdom would come forth from us when we are doing it in a
Of
room surrounded
course.
by other people watching.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, even that is it has its, challenges, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it does have its challenges. And
Yeah.
or what do you do if you are super attracted to someone? How
Yeah.
about that? Let's talk about that because
Yeah.
that I've
It's
had
its
that too.
right. Yes.
Where it's
It's its
like,
own
"Whoa, I'm
source.
looking forward to this scene today." Which I
Yeah.
shouldn't probably. That's terrible. I know. But
Or
yeah,
like we get to be human, right? Like, yes, you are going to be attracted probably at some point in your life to someone you have a scene of intimacy with.
yeah,
And
I've definitely had both. Yeah.
totally. And I think that is yet another way or another space in which, like, having some, when we personally might be feeling all sorts of fluttery things inside, having like a layer of support and grounding structure to hang our hat on can be really helpful. And so, even in terms of choreography, what that can look like is several different things. For some folks and for some moments, it might be truly like choreographing a dance where like moment to moment we're getting really specific about like where are folks making eye contact because that's where the chemistry happens, right? Like folks think chemistry is this like elusive butterfly we're all trying to catch, and it can feel that way. And as intimacy directors, that's also part of our job is to like help folks craft that. And a lot of
Yeah.
that is being intentional about when eye contact happens, for how long, where breath is happening, what are our breath patterns, like
Mhm.
those really niche, weird things that we never think about as humans or rarely think about as humans are part of what my job is to help bring forth.
Find that. Yeah. That
Mhm.
makes perfect sense. That's
Yeah.
like, as actors, you always do there are all these different kinds of exercises
Yeah.
around just looking at
Yeah.
people, right? Looking
Yeah.
at each other. And
Yeah.
I always find that like it always makes me cry. It always like
Mhm.
brings up a lot of
Me
emotion in
too.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I always like even people who I didn't physically find attractive before, I see the beauty in. I can
Mm.
see their soul. I just see them as like
Yeah.
this beautiful human being that just wants to be what we all want, right?
Yes.
And
Mhm.
that alone is a wonderful tip for trying to
Yeah.
get over repulsion because that's more of a
Yeah.
whatever, the masks that people have as they
Mhm.
move through life and the way they move and
Yeah.
the way they interact that can be off-putting.
Yes.
But if you can try and see beyond that into their soul or however you want to put it,
Yeah.
then yeah, I could see where maybe that you could
Yeah.
find the
Find
intimacy in that.
something.
Yeah.
And even when people are experiencing repulsion, I, as an intimacy director, if a so I have my like check-ins with folks before we even start rehearsing. Then throughout the process, folks have like the link to book a little check-in with me. If someone's experiencing that level of like repulsion, I would be curious, and all of it's confidential, right? Except for like anything that is needs to be acted upon and I need to like check in with a director and I'll get the consent of the actor to do that. But questions I would ask about that repulsion is like, is any of that rooted in like not feeling safe with this person? Because your
Mm.
safety, right? We cannot always aim for comfort in a choreography or a scene because sometimes the stories we're telling are not comfortable stories to
Yeah.
tell, right?
Yeah,
But
for
I
sure.
do want folks to feel safe and confident and in control. And
Yeah.
so if that repulsion in any way is rooted in like, I feel really unsafe with this person on set. They're saying really harmful things, or they're acting out and really unpredictable. Like those are things that I think are important to know because those are things we can intervene with. Those are things that we can have a conversation with that actor and figure out a different way. But
Mm.
you're right. If it is just like, we don't, you're just not my vibe.
Yeah.
Um, Having those, right, the intentionality about the eye contact and the breath and how hands move and where hands move and what are the, especially for simulated sex, like how are we moving our hands or our heads to effectively simulate these being like without using super sexualized language. Like you would rarely hear me say, like, okay, and now blowjob, right? That is not something
Right.
I would say. I'm like, okay,
Right.
so we are going to move our head back and forth at this speed in this
Right.
way. You're
Right.
going to imagine this thing or that thing, and it's not going to be the sex act that I'm going to say
Right.
you're going to imagine, even if that is what you go forward and do,
Right.
because my job is to kind of help create our authenticity
Desexualize it?
and desexualize it in as much as like your example of like, what if I'm really into my scene partner? Like me saying, all right, and now y'all fuck. It is not, is going to like make that line between character and actor even blurrier. And
Yeah, for
so,
sure. Yeah.
and in a world in which what blowjob means or fuck means is different to every human, like being specific with my language and making my choreographed recommendations really concrete. Like, okay, you are going to move. Like the other day, I was choreographing, and there is a character who is like trying to make out with his partner's neck. And the actor who was receiving this touch was like, I don't really want his lips on my neck. Great.
Mm.
Do that on stage. It's very easy to do that on stage because people are quite a distance away. And the example, we were like, okay, so your nose will get as far as touching this person's jawline. And then the way you're going to move your head is almost like you are a snake coming out of a basket. Like that is
Oh,
like
wow. Okay.
speed
Yeah.
and the movement, right? So part of my job is figuring out how to describe something really accurately and specifically.
Yes.
Because when we just use shorthand that we use in sex or in like, oh, now it's oral sex. It's like, okay, well, there's a million activities that can happen under that umbrella.
Yeah.
And so let's be specific about what that's going to look like. A, to tell a story that's really compelling and authentic to the audience. And B, to take some of that pressure off the actor to like figure that out for themselves. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a
Yeah.
piece of it. And for some folks, it's less specific. For some folks, it's like, okay, here is the playground. You can touch this part of my body, that part of my body. Please do not touch this part of my body. This area is red for me. This area is green for me. And then from that understanding, folks can kind of improv within that if that is how they prefer to do it. But
Mhm.
having that check in moment earlier to be like, okay, before we hop in here, like this is cool. This is not cool. Please don't touch my neck, right? Whatever the thing might be. And folks feel supported enough with that playground we've created to play spontaneously within that, to your point about that spontaneity piece.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So, and I don't know if you have any information on this, but, and I am beyond it, but I just want to put it out there for
Yeah.
a lot of younger actors who will often be put in situations that they feel uncomfortable and there is no intimacy coordinator on set or in the theater to help out. So what are the conversations that we should be having or that, actors, actresses, actors, I call
Yeah.
everybody actors. What
Yeah.
what should
Everyone.
what should
Yeah.
we be
Actors.
saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. First, if there are any scenes of like physical intimacy in the story, I often I am brought into a production because actors have advocated for an intimacy director.
Mm.
And so knowing that that is something that you have a right to do, and depending on like the scale of a production, it is
Yeah.
like contractually like there's an obligation to have an intimacy director or coordinator if you're doing film. And so knowing that, also knowing that depending on, I know in the US, I think the rule is that they cannot amend your contracts to include different elements of intimacy within 48 hours of filming it. So you
Hmm.
can't just be like, you know what, this just isn't hitting. Let's take your top off. Like, well, okay,
Right.
I get to
Yeah.
consider that. And we need to have 2 days so that we can have some space to make those shifts to contract and all of those things. So
Hmm.
we're beginning to have some like true systems in place. But if there's no intimacy director, if you go to your production folks and are like, hey, I would love one, and they're like, we don't have the budget, which unfortunately is often
I mean,
true.
they're slashing budgets left and right. So it's,
Yeah. And,
yeah.
I mean, not just because I am an intimacy director, but as a human in general, I'm frustrated that often the things that we cut from budgets first are things that are rooted in like the safety and autonomy of the actors. But that's a whole other
Yeah.
story for another
Yeah,
day.
sure. Yeah.
Um, but so first thing that comes to mind is just normalizing, like being the person on set that normalizes, like when you connect with your scene partner and you're about to do whatever the thing is, being the person that checks in and says like, okay, cool. Like, are there any parts of your body that you really don't want touched throughout this experience? Or are there any things that I should know about you
But I'm
before we
talking
hop in
about in a
here?
situation when you're not on set. Like, how do you
Mhm.
advocate for yourself when when, yeah. I mean,
Like just
obviously,
as a
when there's an
human?
intimacy, yeah, right?
Yeah.
If somebody is there to advocate for you, you don't need to really worry about it because I would be having that conversation with you because you would come to me and say, this is your scene. Is there anything that you want, don't want
Yeah.
before we begin?
Well,
Blah,
no,
blah,
I'm
blah.
saying like even if it's two actors on set together without an intimacy director present, like
Okay.
normalizing being that person that
To
says like,
say,
"Hey,"
yeah,
yeah, like, "Hey, before we go, like, is there anything I need to know? Like, is there any part of your body you don't want me touching for this?"
yeah.
Like, and when one of us is the, like, brave, weird one who does that, often what I hear from actors who have had these experiences without an intimacy director present, everyone kind of exhales and it's like,
Mm,
okay, cool. Yes. Thank you. What about you? Okay. Awesome. Sweet. Let's go
yeah,
do it. And so even if there is no one formally doing that, you as the actor gets to check in with your scene partner before you hop in
yeah,
and ask those things.
yeah.
Um, and that also helps give you a stronger sense of trust, which will create richer art, right? When we have like
For
more trust.
sure, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. Do
Yeah.
you think because obviously the director, he, she has they have their vision
Yeah.
of what the scene is supposed to look like. Is this a
Mhm.
conversation that should be had between the three of you?
Yeah, I think it absolutely. And I think something that we explore a lot in intimacy direction training is like just systems of power, right? Part of the reason that this role exists at all is because it's really hard to say no to a director or the person that hired you in general for anything, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And they're not to paint with a broad brush because there are some directors who are so intentional about the power they hold and are
Mm,
like, I want you to say no to me. Like, please tell me if something makes you feel uncomfortable. We can know all of that and still is really hard to do. It still can
yeah.
be like, I
And
still
then
don't
there
want to
are
be that
others who
person.
really push the boundaries,
Yes.
who enjoy
Yeah.
their power
Mhm.
and
And wield
want
it
to wield it.
harmfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so part of the role of intimacy director is kind of this liaison between director's vision and actor's boundaries. And my
Mm,
job is to help find like the center of that Venn diagram. Be like, okay, like this is the story you want to tell. This is the way you will be telling it. Is there something we can do with camera angles? Is there something we can do with lighting? Is there something like what are these other moving pieces that we can play with to tell your story as impactfully as you want it told while also not sacrificing the safety of these humans who are telling the story.
yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
love that. So
yeah.
are there any so a while back, this reminds me of it, and this may or may not
Mhm.
have something to do with you, but it was with self-tapes. And a while
Mhm.
back, there were a lot of audition requests going out to young women. I mean, we're talking like, early 20s,
Yeah.
where it was going to be like for a lead in a feature film. And there was going to be a lot of love scene, sexuality, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And so we need to see what your body looks like. which is yes. I mean, a lot of casting directors put out notices saying this is not okay. You never have to take off your clothes. When you do, I mean, there are situations where they do want to see your body, but that is, like in a safe space and your agent is there or your person of choice and blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. So there are, but it's never normalized
Mm-mm.
to do that. I just want to kind of repeat that
Ah,
because I think a
let's
lot of
repeat that. Yeah.
yes, a lot of young and it's the women, but although I could see where men would get taken advantage of
Sure.
as well, sure.
Absolutely.
And you should never, ever, ever have to take off your clothes for especially a self-tape audition.
No.
Yeah,
Mm-mm. Absolutely not. And I think something like a self tape, even if the folks who are receiving that self tape are handling it with care, there's just something about that video being out in the universe in some way out of our control that feels really problematic to me and really vulnerable and is already assuming a level of vulnerability and trust from the people in the actors before you even have connected as humans. And that to me feels like a red flag. I love a creative solution. That is like my favorite part of this work is like, I love to find a creative solution. And often the thing that we think of as the first option is rarely the most interesting. It's like
right.
when someone says like, actually, I love this, but I really don't love neck touch is one I say a lot because that tends to be true for a lot of people. Like that's an area
Mm,
that need a lot of information before they need a lot of like, okay, in what context, for how long, where is tends to be it's a vulnerable spot for us as humans.
right, right.
Um, and when we are able to like hear someone say like, okay, love it, but maybe not this, maybe we don't touch here. It's like, oh, okay, cool. So what else could we do? And often when we collaborate and find the third thing, it's so much cooler. It's so much more interesting. And so I think even for self tapes, like, okay, you want to see people's body types. Does that mean that you request that people wear leotards for the audition? Does that mean that you ask that folks wear like former fitting clothing for their self tape so that like there can be some middle ground because I do at
Mm,
the point, I understand that sometimes that is something they're taking into consideration. And I love your example of like, okay, maybe we do need to see your body, but we are going to outline for you very specifically ahead of time what to expect, how long you will be expected to be like unclothed in this manner, who is in the room. It is not going to be filmed, like whatever
exactly.
those
Yeah,
pieces of
yeah.
information
But
are.
that is for someone who has an agent, someone because always in this situation, you need someone advocating for you because
Mhm.
all of a sudden, and I think probably with women more than men, but maybe just because that's my
I think you're right.
reference, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like, oh man, the lead in a film. And, I could see my 20-year-old self like
absolutely.
totally falling for something like that.
Yeah,
Whereas,
absolutely.
today, like, no, that's not happening.
Yeah. Which
But
is why these like conversations and these like podcasts and the work you do is so relevant because that so many folks jump into the wild and are like, okay, I guess this is just what it's like. And I even in acting
yes.
programs, I met someone
Yeah.
recently who their acting teacher had them in one of their courses, they had to like go to the lake. They lived in a mountain town and had to go to the lake in winter and stand in the lake in winter and give their monologue. And it was like you're going to have to be uncomfortable. How uncomfortable are you willing to get for your art? And and that's in an educational environment. Like what a terrible foundation of expectations are you setting for these actors that
Yeah.
actually what your safety and your like dignity as a human actually doesn't really matter to them. Whereas not
Right.
right. But
Yeah.
having that
Yeah.
advocate, and that's part of what my job is. I love that my job is part advocate, part choreographer. It's the best of both
Mm,
worlds for me that like you don't have to do this by yourself. Like
right.
let me do it. Let me have the hard conversation for you, or let me come with you to have the hard conversation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
because it's really, especially for young women or people who are moving into the world in marginalized identities, there are so many barriers, invisible or otherwise, that keep us small and quiet and accommodating and keeps folks who are wielding their power harmfully, wielding it harmfully. And
Yeah.
sometimes we wield it harmfully and we have no idea, right? Like we can be well-intentioned humans and still power exists. And so naming it and acknowledging it actually helps us disrupt it and be creative with it.
Mhm. Yeah, such good advice. Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you would like to mention? Is there anything else that we need to know about,
Ah,
as you know, from an actor's point of view, from an
mm,
intimacy coordinator, directors,
yeah, I
mouth to
think
my ears?
mhm. Yeah. Well, I think if anyone is listening to this as an actor and is like, I want to like be that person on set or on stage who is, even if there's no intimacy director and no one else is talking about it, I feel like I have the personality or the tools to like be that culture bearer and like be the one who's like, hey, let's come up with like a check in, check out at the beginning and end of rehearsal so we can kind of like cue our bodies into the fact that rehearsal is over and now I get to be me again and go back to my life.
Mm,
IDC has a consent forward actor training. And so you can get a consent forward actor certificate that teaches you a lot of these foundational skills so that you can be that person
wow.
in your
Okay, that's
spaces.
interesting. Yeah.
And there are other intimacy direction programs that maybe don't do certification, but also just have really awesome workshops ongoing that are pretty affordable. That if folks are like, yeah, this the way it's happening feels terrible. What are other ways to do it so that you can then go forth and be that culture
Yeah.
shifter? Because I think that is the place we are in the industry is that slowly folks are shifting culture and
Yeah.
advocating for themselves
Yeah.
and each other.
You brought up an interesting point that made me think of you said it earlier and you just said it again now.
Mm.
Because a lot of times we do an intimate scene that has nothing to do with sex, right? But you do a scene where maybe you've been mean to someone, right?
Mhm.
Who you actually really like.
Yeah.
And there is always, I think, just naturally, I do it. I'm a really maternal person anyway. So
Mhm.
it's like, it's like, are you okay? And I
Yeah.
immediately want to hug that person, which who knows that may be,
Right.
also, right? So it's just me as a human being, how I react
Yeah.
to things. But yeah, I think it's good just to be aware, just to have that conversation, even at the close of a scene, if something intense has gone
Mhm.
on, where you just go, are you okay? Do we need to talk? Do we need, do you or shake it off? That's another thing.
Yes.
I've worked with coaches who are just like, oh, get that off me, I'm done. That
Yes.
did not feel good, and now it's done, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that is something that my hope and dream for the world is that we normalize that for folks, regardless of if their scenes are like capital I intimate.
Mm,
Because, like I said earlier, our bodies don't know the difference between acting and truly experiencing something. And
yeah.
so, part of our job with our scene partners, as well as with ourselves, is to figure out those closure rituals to like create bookends for the experience. And so, some ways that folks do that, and an analogy I use, I don't know if you've ever seen The Parent Trap with Lindsay Lohan, but
Oh my
she and her
gosh. Long
right,
time
it's a
ago.
long time ago.
Yeah.
She and her butler have this, like, ridiculous, super ornate, secret handshake, and it does not have to be that ornate, but some sort of, like, a high five and a thank you, or, like, a deep breath that you and your scene partner share together before you do the scene and after you do the scene, something that is,
Mm.
like, embodied and has some sort of sound to it helps
Mm.
our nervous systems cue in that, like, "Okay, that was the beginning, and now"
Oh,
even
that's
if
interesting. I could see where
right?
that would work. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even because that stuff, like, I don't know, it, like, comes with us out into life, and sometimes, like, literally shaking off what just happened and brushing off the scene can be really supportive, and so, like, having those rituals with yourself and or with your scene partners can be really grounding, and something in I work with actors in especially on stage, I think there's some more ways to get, creative with this, but I can see it working in on screen too, is getting creative with how you as a human stay grounded in really activating scenes. So, for example, I had an actor who there was a scene where folks were yelling at each other, and this actor was like, "I this is very similar to a family dynamic I come from, and I am having a really hard time not floating away and dissociating during this scene. And so part of the way we choreographed it was like, where are some spaces for you to touch the desk and like feel your hands on a
Keep yourself
surface and take
grounded,
a breath?
literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
there a crystal or a stone or something in your pocket we can have in your costume pocket that you can touch and know is there and help bring you back down? And so figuring out those like little sneaky ways to ground even within the scene is also
Mm,
something that I love to support actors in doing, because you're right.
mm.
It can get fluttery.
Yeah,
And
for
sometimes
sure.
that is part of the work. And sometimes it's so fluttery that actually it is impeding your ability to do the work.
Mm.
Yeah.
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 Well, Veronica, thank you so
Oh my
much for
gosh.
this. This has been really informative, really good. Where can people get a hold of you?
Yeah. So I am on the internet at the dress rehearsal with a last name like dress. You gotta lean in. And
Absolutely.
so on Instagram, I am at the.dress. And my website is dressrehearsal.space. That's where you can find my info to book me for intimacy direction. It's also where you can, if you are looking for a sexuality and intimacy coach, or to have someone come in and do training for your like for your theater production or your theater in general. I can come and like kind of help give y'all the foundational tools so that whether or not there's an intimacy director, y'all kind of have that framework.
Yeah.
Dressrehearsal.space is me.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so, so much.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, this
Yeah.
was a delight. What a fun way
Yeah.
to spend a morning.
Absolutely. So let us know in the comments what really stood out for you from this conversation. And if you've ever worked with an intimacy coordinator or director, I'd love to know that too. And until next time, you stay your bold and beautiful self. Bye bye.